So this morning we're going to follow along with the scripture passage that we started last week with Pastor Don Robinson. And as you might remember, that was all about the disciples being up in Galilee. They had gone there because Jesus had told them to go, and they don't really know what to do while they're there. And so they decide to go fishing. And so Pastor Don talked about how they were in the boat, they weren't catching anything. This was something that should have reminded them of who might be on the beach, but they didn't get it, and finally they figured out, oh, it's Jesus on the beach. And so our story continues on from there today as Peter jumps out of the boat, the others try and get this load of fish into the shore, and then we begin our story. So this morning, I want to read to you the scripture passage, and I want you to join along with me as it'll be up on the screen. So, it starts in verse 15. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will touch you and lead you where you do not want to go." Peter. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Peter turned and saw the disciple, whom Jesus loved, was following them. This is the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Because of this, the rumor spread among the believers that this disciple would not die. But Jesus did not say he would not die. He only said, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you?" This is the disciple who testifies to these things, who wrote them down. We know his testimony is true. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So with that passage in mind, I want you to think about something. Have you ever been betrayed by a close friend? You probably have. I know I have. But more importantly, have you ever betrayed a good friend and then desperately regretted it? Wished that you had never done it and wanted forgiveness, but were not quite sure if you'd ever get it? Have you tried to restore a broken relationship, but you were living with regret over something that you had done or said? Our experiences of friendship and betrayal and restoration are keys to understanding this passage this morning. So, like in our world, in the ancient world, there were lots of different kinds of friendship that people experienced. And they were all different levels as well. But all of them had one thing in common, and that was that they really strongly, and I cannot express this enough, they strongly expected loyalty. That was a key component to a friendship. Nowadays, loyalty is something we kind of expect, but we often don't experience it in quite the same way that they did. Loyalty was a big deal back in the ancient world. So, friendship was important, and betraying your friend was one of the absolute worst things that you could have done. And so before we actually dive into the scripture we're going to talk about this morning, we need to look at friendship, because it's the way that they looked at it was slightly different than the way we look at it. So, and that will help us understand what was going on between Peter and Jesus. So the first kind of friendship in the ancient world is something we experience today. It's called political friendships. And those are people that you make friends with because they are more well-situated politically. They might be a royal person or somebody who has power and control that might help you move up the ladder. And so that was very common in the ancient world. You associated yourself with some ruler and worked your way into getting into his good graces. And that person who was working their way into being a friend was called a friend. So you might remember that when Pilate was trying Jesus and he was trying to free him, the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." They knew that title, friend of Caesar, was really important, and that it would place a tremendous amount of pressure on Pilate if they used it. And they did. Being a friend of Caesar was something that Pilate, as a Roman soldier, had sworn to do as part of his military oaths. So not only would it ruin his career, but it also could cost him his life if he disobeyed or seemed to be disloyal to the emperor, his friend. So then next, on a kind of a lower level politically or socially, there were the local patrons, and there was a patron-client relationship. And in a sense, we have that sort of thing in our world, but it's not quite the same thing. In the ancient world, you gained honor and status in your community by doing good deeds of civic virtue, like building buildings and being good to the poor and doing all these noteworthy things. And one of those things was being a patron. If you were wealthy or you had influence and you had needy people around you, you could enter into a client-patron relationship with them. These people were your friends, supposedly, but it really was a very, it wasn't a reciprocal relationship. It was something where you had something they wanted or needed, and you were willing to get it so that you would gain status in the community. You would be known as the patron of so-and-so. It's kind of like we think about influencers on social media and the whole idea of as many people, many likes as you can get, or as many followers as you can get, that increases your status. Well, that was the way that it was in the ancient world. And so if you're a wealthy man, usually, you would have office hours in your house, and during a particular time, you would expect that your clients would come to talk with you about whatever they needed or wanted. And it was this sign of status, how many people you had traipsing into your door during those hours to come and consult with you or talk with you or get something for you or support you in some way. So that was a patron-client relationship. And so one of the reasons why the Apostle Paul had such trouble with the Corinthian church and why he did not want to take any money from the wealthy Corinthian elders was because the client-patron relationship was really big in Corinth. And he understood that these elders were thinking, well, if we give Paul some money to support him in his missionary work, then we'll be his patron, and he can be our client. And Paul says, no, wait a minute here. That's not the way that this works. The gifts have to be freely given with no strings because I am a servant of Jesus. I'm not your client. In fact, I am your pastor, and that's a different role. So third, in the ancient world, there were casual friendships between equals, such as like the guilds or associations. We have those today, like if you join the Kiwanis Club or you're a member of a bowling league or something like that. So in the ancient world, funerary societies were really big. And that was because people knew that, well, funerals cost a lot of money. So if you join a funerary society, not only will you have friends who will come to your funeral, but you also have people who will help pay for the funeral as well. So you joined the funerary society by giving some money. But there were also expectations that went along with that. You were expected to go to the association or the guild or the society's functions. And that caused problems for Christians because that meant that they had to associate with people who were doing all sorts of stuff during these ceremonies that probably wasn't godly. And they were also eating food sacrificed to the idols. And they were having to meet in the temples where these associations had their gatherings. And what did you do? So this caused a lot of problems, especially in the Corinthian church. And Paul writes part of his letter, 1 Corinthians 8, to help them kind of sort out those kind of issues. So could they eat meat sacrificed to idols, or couldn't they? What should they do? They were part of these societies, and they were important in their lives. So how did they deal with all the conflicts that would come? So then last, there were close friendships of equal companions. And the ancient authors wrote a lot about this. I cannot tell you how much they wrote about it, because it was a great deal. In fact, some of the most famous works, like the Symposium, were written to discuss friendship. And what does friendship mean? And how does it work in people's lives? It was something that especially groups of men who were close friends would sit around tables and drink wine and talk about. So friendship was really crucial in Greco-Roman society. And think about where Peter and Paul and all of the disciples were. They were in Jerusalem, but they were also part of the ancient Greco-Roman world because of being under Roman rule and also the influence of Greek culture in their lives. And so this idea of friendship, close friendships as being really critical, had infiltrated as well into Jewish society. So in the ancient world, this idea of friendship was what they focused on. In our culture, we focus on romance between a man and a woman. So you have all these movies and books that all talk about these romances. Ron and I just went to England, and we spent some time going to Jane Austen's house and doing some of the Jane Austen thing. And Jane Austen is about social commentary, but it's also about romance. So that wasn't at all the case in the ancient world. In the ancient world, you got married to someone of the opposite sex, either for political advantage or because you wanted to have legitimate offspring so that you could pass your wealth or whatever down to the next generation. But the idea of romance between a man and a woman where you found your soulmate, it was kind of like, what? What are you talking about? That's not how this works. Instead, especially in ancient Greek culture, you found your soulmate with somebody who was of the same sex as you were, biological sex as you were. They were your buddy. They were your close friend. They were your other me. It was that sort of I found myself in you sort of an an experience that oftentimes we experience that in our culture in romantic love. But they experience that sort of a relationship in friendship. And so again, friendship was really critical. This kind of friendship depended upon intimacy, and not necessarily physical intimacy, but emotional intimacy, mutual honor and support, the sharing of resources during hard times, doing things together. Usually there was a heroic aspect to this, like our companions in war, or our companions on this trip across the Adriatic to go and explore new lands, or something like that. There was this sense of we're in this together that was part of those relationships. And also really important was the ability to share your heart, your innermost thoughts, and your secrets with your friend. And you knew someone was a true friend if you could share everything with them and they held that in confidence. That was really important. So in some rare cases, somebody might die for their friend, but that wasn't necessarily expected. Although it was praised in some of the literature as this is a heroic and wonderful thing to do for your friend. But in reality, it didn't happen that much. So these are these different kinds of friendship. And so it's interesting when you read through the Bible and you look at what kind of friendships does God prefer? And surprisingly, it's the last one. We might think that God would say, well, I'm the king of the universe. I am the ruler of the world. Everybody should bow down to me, and everybody is reliant upon me and my goodness to them, which is true. But God doesn't usually, when he's wanting to talk with somebody, he doesn't usually play that card. Also the patron-client thing. Of course God is the provider. We are the needy ones. God, our world needs him to sustain itself. But in terms of his interactions with human beings, God wants to be the kind of God that can walk in the garden and talk about things and share innermost thoughts with someone. And we see that, for example, in the Garden of Eden, where it says that God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. And you can just imagine that they're there wandering around and talking about the plants and the animals, and God is telling them things that he's noticing, and they're talking back. It's that sort of intimate relationship that God wants. And unfortunately, he lost that relationship with Adam and Eve when they decided to betray him. They didn't believe him. They believed Satan instead and chose to follow Satan rather than God. And that sort of an intimate betrayal, we don't read it as just a really horrific thing, but in the ancient world, that story would have been just kind of gut-wrenching because of the betrayal of the close friendship. Also in the Bible, when we read about some of the great leaders of the faith, you have Abraham. And Abraham is called God's friend in a couple of places. And rather than treating Abraham as a servant, God chooses to share with him the things that he's thinking. One of the examples is when we're thinking about Sodom and Gomorrah and what should happen with that, God says, should I hide from Abraham this thing that I'm thinking about doing with Sodom and Gomorrah? And he says, no, I'm going to tell him. And then he and Abraham have this rather extended conversation about what's going to happen with Sodom and Gomorrah. Is God going to be merciful or not? And on what basis? And it's that sort of sharing of friendship, sharing of dialogue with each other that's held up as Abraham is a friend of God, that God can have those kind of relationships with him. And then there's also Moses. Moses is also talked about as a friend of God, and it says that he has face-to-face conversations with God, and that God speaks to him like a man speaks to his friend. And you might remember the story of after the whole incident with the golden calf, God and Moses are talking, and Moses says, "Please show me your glory." And God says, "Well, you can't see my face and live." But that's what Moses wants. He wants to know God as intimately as he can. He wants to see God's face. And God says, "Well, all you can see is my back. So I'll put you in this cleft of the rock, and I'll put my hand over you to protect you and cover you, but then you can see a glimpse of my glory as I go by." And once you understand what's going on in terms of friendship, you understand what a gift that was to both God and to Moses. Moses asked for a deeper relationship with God, and God graciously gave it because he wanted to share who he was with his friend Moses. When we come to the New Testament, we look at Jesus. Now, Jesus as God in the flesh could have operated according to the kingly sort of thing. After all, he was the king. He was God incarnate, the king of the universe come in human person. He could have claimed those kingly rights and treated people like his subjects, but he didn't. He also didn't do the patron-client thing where, I have all the resources, I know exactly who I'm going to dole it out to so that I increase in status. Instead, he saw need and he responded out of love because he cared for those people and he wanted to develop those relationships. It was an act of friendship, not an act of patronage. So we see Jesus developing this community of friends. They're not just casual friends. It's not just the Jesus Club that you can come and join. It's this deep, intimate community of people who are very different from each other, but who have learned to love and care for each other and pretty much have committed themselves to being with each other for the rest of their lives with Jesus. And then there comes this crisis. Jesus is arrested. What's going to happen to this close community of people? Will they just kind of scatter and do their own thing? Or will they stay together as close, committed friends? That's one of the things that Jesus prays for during the Last Supper, is he's brought them together. He says to God the Father that he has kept all of them together up until now, and now he prays for them, that they will love each other as he has loved them, that deep friendship, abiding, committed love will continue with all of them together, even after he leaves. And it's interesting to note that Jesus didn't just have this kind of love for the 12 disciples. That's it. If you didn't make the cut in terms of being the 12, you were out. Because other places it talks about people being Jesus' friend. And in John 11, where Lazarus is really ill, some of the people who knew Lazarus came and they went on a trip to Jesus, who was quite a ways away, and said, "Master, the one you love, your friend, is ill. Come and help and make him well." And so it's not just the 12, but Mary and Martha and Lazarus were close friends of Jesus. They were the people that he liked to hang out with and share his thoughts with and his teaching with. And you see that when he goes to visit Mary and Martha, and Mary is sitting with the other men, and Jesus is teaching and talking, and she's just sitting there listening to him, just like any other friend, like any other disciple. She loves this man, and she wants to hear him and be with him. So Jesus had lots of friends, and friends who loved him and listened willingly to him. Now, with this understanding of ancient friendship, it helps us understand the passage from John that Jesus says right before in the upper room, right before he is led off to be crucified and arrested. And he says to the disciples, "Love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay one's life down for one's friend. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends, for everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you." So think about those words. Those would be words that would be ringing in Peter's mind ever since that night, which was probably maybe 2 weeks or a little bit more ago from the time that we're talking about in our passage. He would have heard those words. He would have understood that Jesus said, I'm not going to treat you like servants. You are my friends, the deep, intimate sort of friends. Jesus uses the word phileo, which is the word in Greek that is for that deep, close friendship. You are my friends. So, now that we know what that is all about, that view of friendship, let's talk through what has happened since Easter up to the present. We talked some about that last week, but I want us to get a bigger picture of what might have happened. And I also want us to think about this in terms of not just understanding the timeline, but imagine how Peter is responding to all of this. What's going on with him emotionally? If we can understand what's going on with him emotionally, that kind of unlocks the passage. Otherwise, you just read it and it's like, do you love me? Yes. Do you love me? Yes. Do you love me? Yes. But there's so much more going on in this passage. There's this whole history of friendship and betrayal that's behind all of those words. So, the morning on the beach that is in our passage, that wasn't the first time that that Peter has seen Jesus since the resurrection. We're told in Luke 24:33 and 34, and 1 Corinthians 15:5, that the first person that Jesus appeared to after his resurrection, and the women in the tomb and all that sort of stuff, but the first person he made a beeline to was Peter. But we don't know what they talked about or even how long the conversation was. We know it can't be very long because we're also told in Luke that Jesus spent the whole afternoon with 2 other disciples on the road to Emmaus, and that it got to be evening, and they invited him to come stay with them. So there's this little sliver of window of time in between when he was raised from the dead, and there's all the women and people running to the tomb and trying to figure out what happened. And then probably from like noon on, his conversation with the people on the road to Emmaus. So somewhere in that little time frame of mid-morning, Jesus and Peter encountered each other. Then, that night, Jesus appeared to the 10, or perhaps 11 disciples, together, and they were together in the room, and he had a conversation with them, but there is no personal conversation, apparently, that takes place. They talk with him, and and then they tell Thomas, who apparently is not there, the Lord is risen. And Thomas says, I'm not going to believe this craziness. But it seems like Jesus is there for the disciples as a group. He's not going to have a personal conversation with Peter and process what happened with the betrayal. That just doesn't happen. And then he appears again to them, and Thomas is there. And again, Jesus is dealing with Thomas and his issue. He's not dealing with Peter and his issue. And then the disciples are told to go off to Galilee, and so they go. And so now it's about 2 weeks later, and Peter still hasn't had that significant conversation with Jesus in terms of reconciling that relationship, being able to apologize, just seeing if Jesus is really angry with him. There's no opportunity for that has been given so far. So if you're Peter, and if you're like me, having a wounded relationship or a damaged relationship hang on for that long of a time really gets to you. It just gnaws away at you, and you keep looking for ways of resolving this, and they don't come, and it starts eating away at you. You start feeling helpless. You start feeling angry. You start feeling shameful, like especially if you did something. You're just going, how could I have done that? And trying to figure out what's wrong with me that I could have done that sort of a terrible thing to my friend. You would feel sad. There would just be this kind of sadness that would be living with you. You want to get things resolved, but you don't know how to, and you haven't had the opportunity. So you would also feel really frustrated. At least I feel frustrated when I'm in that sort of a situation. I'm somebody who takes seriously, don't let the sun go down on your anger, get it sorted out, and I'm somebody who wants to resolve relationships and get back to that normal, what I consider normal friendship, where I care about that person cares about me, and we're not angry with each other. Peter hasn't had that opportunity yet. So, in the story that Pastor Don told us last week, we're told that there's this person on the shore. They can't quite figure out who he is because it's early morning. He tells them to drop the nets over this other side of the boat. They catch a lot of fish. John goes, "Oh, it's Jesus." And Peter looks, and he flings himself out of the boat. I mean, it's just like, bam. All that pent-up energy and everything just kind of explodes. He just doesn't know what to do. He just knows he has to get to Jesus, and he needs to get to Jesus before other people do because he wants to have this conversation. But when he gets to the shore, he doesn't know what to do. He kind of stops, and he's standing there, and the others are trying to haul in this enormous load of fish, and he's standing there, and he's kind of stuck. And so then Jesus breaks the awkward moment by saying, why don't you go get some of the fish and bring them over here and we'll cook them? And so Peter does, and he goes over and he helps them get the fish into the shore. And then everybody's there, and they're cooking fish. And the moment for Jesus and Peter to have their encounter is gone. Peter's sitting there, and he's trying to figure out, what are we going to do? How can this be right? Here I am. I'm part of the disciples. Jesus has just given us this commission to go into all the world, and there's, given us the promise of his Holy Spirit, and I'm sitting here, and everybody knows that I've betrayed him. He knows that I've betrayed him, and we can't talk about it. I don't know what to do. So, he starts thinking about what has happened over the last couple of weeks. He thinks about the first time that Jesus told him to fling the net over the other side. That was when he was called as a disciple. He had seen this miraculous thing. He had knelt down in front of Jesus and said, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful person. I don't deserve to be in your presence." And Jesus said, "Don't worry. From now on, you'll be catching fish." And that was it. He left his nets, and he went with Jesus. He was a disciple. That was the first time. This is the second time. He didn't know what was going to happen this time. Then another memory probably comes. He remembers that when he ate the Passover with Jesus a couple of weeks ago, He had insisted emphatically that even though Jesus said that they were all going to desert him, that he never would. Even if everybody else left him, he was going to be the faithful friend who was willing to die for him. And yet he hadn't. The smoke that's drifting around from this fire reminds him of another fire. And Pastor Don reminded us about that last week. There was this fire that was in the courtyard of the high priest that Peter was sitting around. And as he sat around it, people started saying, "Aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" And he said, I'm not one of his disciples. "Well, but I thought I've seen you with him. Sure, and you have this Galilean accent. Surely you're one of them." "Oh, no, I'm not associated with him." And he had denied Jesus 3 times. In the short space, he's thinking about, Jesus called me, I swore that I'd be faithful to him, and I betrayed him. That's my life story with Jesus. I don't know what's going to happen next. He knew that he was a sinful man, that he had betrayed his friend and Lord, and that he didn't deserve the grace that he so desperately wanted. Perhaps he just needed to ask Jesus to go away and leave him alone, like he had the first time, and maybe Jesus would this time. But when they finished eating, Jesus beckoned Peter to come and walk with him. So as they're walking along the shoreline and talking, the hoped-for but dreaded conversation starts. John 21:15 tells us that Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" And commentators have debated a lot about what "these" means. They just don't know. But what I can imagine is that as they're walking along and they're looking at the fishermen counting the fish and figuring things out, Jesus could be kind of waving, "Do you love me more than these? More than this boat that's your boat, and fishing and this whole life in Capernaum that you have? Do you love me more than these? Are you willing to leave them like you did the first time to be my disciple? Or not?" Or maybe Jesus was asking, as he looked at the other disciples, "Do you love me more than these disciples? Love me more than these people who they ran away when I was arrested, but they didn't betray me like you did? You said that even if everyone else abandoned me, you would not. But you did. You disowned me 3 times, as I told you you would. Do you really love me more than these other men?" Or perhaps Jesus was asking Peter, "Do you love me more than anything else in the world?" Jesus had used the word agapao, which is a Greek word, and that's the word that's used in the Greek translation of the Old Testament for just kind of a general sort of love. It's God's love for people, people's love for each other, people's love for God, just the general word that the translators used. But in classical Greek, it has this meaning of not just love in general, but love of the beloved, and that sees the person being loved as having infinite value. And Jesus may be asking Peter, so there's all of this stuff here, but do you love me more than anything else? So Peter's kind of taken aback. He not quite sure what to say, and he says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." But interestingly enough, the word that he uses is not agapao. It's phileo, which is the word for that intimate kind of friendship, that intimate kind of love. And so you think, now why did he do that? Jesus asked him using one word, but Peter reverted back to the friendship word. Why? Did Peter want to affirm the friendship? I think maybe so. That he's so caught into, I've got to make this up to Jesus. I've got to show him that I'm his close friend, even though I betrayed him, that's the word that he uses. He says, I am your close friend. Even though I betrayed you, I am your close friend. And then Jesus replies to him, feed my lambs. Peter was also not expecting this, because Jesus was giving him a new commission. Before, Jesus had said, I'm going to make you fishers of men. He was going to be an evangelist. He was a disciple, and his job would be to evangelize. But now Jesus is saying, feed my lambs. And Peter knew that meant caring for the other disciples, caring for that group of friends that Jesus had gathered around him, that little flock. And Peter remembered that Jesus had claimed to be the good shepherd. And you see that all throughout the Gospels. There's a lot of good shepherd imagery in the Gospels. And that idea comes from, in particular, from Ezekiel 34, where God is saying to the leaders of Israel that he's really frustrated with them as being the shepherds of his people Israel. And because they were such terrible shepherds, he was going to have to come in person and take over and become their shepherd. He was going to rescue his people from faraway places. He was going to feed them. He was going to do everything that was needed for them to be nourished and healthy. And when Jesus came, he said, I am the good shepherd. And these men who knew their Jewish Bibles would know exactly what he meant. It was a claim that he was the chosen shepherd that had been promised in Ezekiel. And he says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And Jesus had done that. But then Peter also remembers that Jesus had also said, the hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it, and the man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. With Judas's betrayal, the wolf had come, and the little flock of Jesus' disciples was scattered just as he had predicted. But I imagine at that moment, Peter just felt like this feeling. He had been one of the leaders of this little group of disciples. And instead of acting like the good shepherd, he was the hired hand. He was the one who had run off and abandoned everyone else. So how is it possible now that Jesus was asking him to be a good shepherd for these disciples that he had abandoned? It was kind of mind-blowing. In the midst of all these thoughts, Jesus again says to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Again, he uses the word agapao. Do you love and value me above everything else? Are you willing to give up everything for me? So why did he ask the question again? Hadn't Peter already demonstrated his love for Jesus by flinging himself out of the boat and making his way to shore, and just the way he was looking at Jesus and everything that Peter could do to communicate his love for Jesus, he was doing. Didn't Jesus know that? So he responds, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. But again, he uses the word phileo. You know that I am your intimate friend, I'm your close friend. And then Jesus responds again. Take care of my sheep. So he calls Peter a second time to be this under-shepherd. Peter's just trying to wrap his mind around what is going on here. And then another memory comes to mind. When Jesus told Peter about his betrayal, he had also said, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. That was it. Those words, and when you turn back, strengthen your brothers. Jesus had known all along about Jesus' betrayal. Peter didn't want to think he had, but he had. And he also knew that that was not a final statement of their relationship. Jesus knew that Peter would turn back. And so he says, and when you do, make sure you shepherd your brothers. Jesus had prayed for him that his faith wouldn't fail, and it didn't. And he was confident that Peter would return to lead and care for the other disciples. Amazing. He had not been rejected as Jesus' friend and disciple after all. And then a third time, Jesus said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And interestingly, this time, Jesus uses the word phileo, that word for intimate friendship. You think, now why did he do that? It's like the penny had clicked for Peter, and Jesus was affirming, yes, we are friends. We are intimate friends. Says to Peter, do you love me as a close friend? But Peter doesn't understand what's going on. It says he was hurt because Jesus had asked him a third time, don't you believe me, Jesus? He said to the Lord, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. You know what I did in the past. You knew what I was going to do. You know that I was going to return. So why are you asking me a third time? And then it dawned on him. 3 times he had betrayed Jesus. 3 times Jesus had asked him if he had loved him. And then 3 times he was given a new commission. Not just 2 times or 1 time, but 3 times. He was restored. He had been forgiven. He was back in the relationship with Jesus that he so desired. 2 times wasn't enough. There had to be that third question. So Jesus says a third time, feed my sheep. And then he continues. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Jesus truly did know everything, and he wanted to make sure that Peter clearly knew the cost of following him. With arms outstretched was commonly understood to be a reference to crucifixion, and Peter would indeed die for his close friend in the future. But despite what Jesus had just told him about his death, the anxiety and tension drained out of Peter. He was forgiven and recommissioned and excited and distracted. Verse 20 says that Peter turned around and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. And it explains that he was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and said to him, Lord, who is going to betray you? And when Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" This beloved disciple was John's fishing buddy and close friend. And Peter was curious about what was going to happen to him. I mean, Jesus had just talked with him about his commission. What about John's? And Jesus basically says to him, "It's none of your business. If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? You must follow me." Now, remember, Jesus and Peter have had this long relationship. And there may have been many, many times when Jesus looked at Peter and said, "Peter, you're distracted. Focus." And so when he tells him that it's none of his business, he knows that there's been this change in Peter and that Peter is just emoting and curious and life is great again and stuff. And so probably he hasn't heard very much about what Jesus just said. And church tradition tells us that Peter faithfully led and cared for the early believers for about 30 years. And his final years of ministry were in Rome. Our New Testament includes 2 letters, 1st and 2nd Peter, attributed to them. And in the first, Peter encourages believers suffering persecution to stay faithful and look to the example of Jesus, the shepherd and overseer of their souls. And he also encourages church leaders to be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. An early church tradition says that Roman authorities sentenced Peter to death at Rome's Vatican Hill, and that he died by being crucified upside down at the time of the Great Fire in Rome in AD 64 under the Emperor Nero. John, the beloved disciple, had a very different life. John 18:15 through 16 tells us that John was in the courtyard at the high priest's house when Peter denied Jesus. He was known by the high priest, and he was also known by the servant girl who was the one who let them in. They knew that he was a disciple of Jesus, and yet he didn't deny Jesus. Also, at the crucifixion, all the other disciples are gone. Who's standing there at the foot of the cross with the women and the mother of Jesus? It's John. And if you remember that when Jesus sees his mother standing there and John standing there, he says to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that time on, John took her into his home. And according to early church tradition, John ended up in Ephesus, helping to pastor the church there. From there, he wrote his 3 letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and also the gospel. And at some point, he was exiled to the Greek island of Patmos as well, and where he wrote the book of Revelation, according to tradition. But Mary lived there with John until she died in Ephesus. And John died in Ephesus. And I've actually been to Ephesus and seen his tomb. So that's exciting for me to have this connection, this personal connection. So tradition says that John lived into a very old age, and that might be why there's all this stuff at the very end that seems like it's kind of confusing, talking about this rumor that he would not have died, and that there were these witnesses that were attesting to the authenticity of this gospel, and all sorts of stuff going on towards the end of this section that don't seem to be related to the story we've talked about today at all. And so perhaps you can just kind of divide the passage into those 2 sections. The sections about Peter, and then just the closing stuff that John and his witnesses are including. Interestingly enough, John did not die a martyr's death. He seems to be the only one of the original apostles who died of natural causes, and he lived to be very old, probably and died about 98 AD. So he probably, from the time that he would have become a disciple of Jesus, probably was a disciple for about 60 years. And in that particular time frame, that was a really old age. So, as you've thought about this story this morning, kind of been processing things, what do you think God might want you to be coming away with from this story, from what you've heard this morning? Are there experiences of betrayal and forgiveness in your own life that he wants you to process? Are there things about your friendship with God that he wants you to think about? Do you have that sort of intimate friendship with God where you can tell him anything and he can tell you anything, where you walk together and have conversations, that he is the one who is closer to you than anyone else? Is that the kind of relationship you want to have with God? I think that's the kind of relationship he wants to have with you. Another thing you might want to think about is this whole issue of God knows our futures. Jesus knew what Peter would do. It didn't surprise him. He also knew he would return. He also knew that he would recommission him to be one of the main leaders of the early church. God knows our future, and it's often different from the person who we might live with, our husband or our wife or other family member, or our friends. We each have individual stories, individual walks with Jesus. And Jesus knows all about that, and he knows what will happen. So the question is, can you trust him to walk ahead of you, and then you can just follow him into the future? Something to think about. There may be other things that God has spoken to you about during this sermon. And if you want to spend some time thinking about that too, that's fine. So at this point, I want to give us a couple minutes to just process. I know I've given you a lot of information and a lot of stuff to think about. So I want to give you a few minutes to think about that. And Paul is going to play a little bit on the piano, and the kids are supposed to be coming in quietly during this time, so we'll see if they do.